Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
Right before they wheeled me into the operating room, just as the sedative started to fog the edges of my vision, my mother leaned over and gripped my hand like she was playing the role of the grieving matriarch in some off-Broadway production. Her breath smelled faintly of mint tea and guilt, and in that syrupy sweet voice she reserved for funerals and fundraising dinners, she said, "If you don't make it, at least your sister gets the house." I didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even look her in the eyes. I just nodded like a good daughter would, but not for the reason she thought. I woke up 2 days later in a hospital room that smelled like bleach and resignation, with a machine beeping steadily beside me and a dull ache pressing down on my chest like a toddler sitting there, just enough to remind me I had survived. The nurse told me I'd done great. The doctors were impressed. My vitals were strong. My mother, on the other hand, had already left for her afternoon bridge game, and my sister hadn't even bothered to show up. Lying there, staring up at those ceiling tiles patterned like boring snowflakes, I wasn't thinking about God or second chances or even what comes after death. I was thinking about that house, my father's house. The one with the cracked stone walkway and the magnolia tree that bloomed late every spring, no matter what. The one he built with his bare hands in the late 70s, dragging boards up that hill every weekend while Evelyn stayed back in the city, too busy with cocktails and committees to care. That house should have been mine the second he passed. But Evelyn, my mother, who always acted more like a real estate agent than a parent, held the deed like a poker chip, dangling it over my head for years with little comments like, "Well, if you ever settle down," or "Nicole has more space in her apartment. Maybe we give her a wing." Nicole, the golden girl who couldn't keep a plant alive, let alone manage a mortgage. The thing is, I had already changed the will. Weeks before the surgery, when the cardiologist mentioned unpredictable complications and started talking percentages, I called Greg. Greg's been my lawyer since college and my friend even longer. We sat in his office on a rainy Thursday, and I signed every document with hands that didn't shake. I left the house not to Nicole, not to Evelyn, but to someone none of them would see coming. They thought I'd be too weak to fight. They thought if the surgery took me, they'd finally win. Evelyn with her smug smile, Nicole with her inheritance daydreams. They thought death would be the end of the story. But I had been planning this chapter for years. I pressed the nurse call button, not because I needed anything, but because I wanted someone to confirm I was still here. Still breathing. Still in control. She came in with a kind face and gentle hands, and I asked if she could pass me my phone. It was sitting in a little plastic bin on the windowsill, screen lighting up every few seconds like a desperate lighthouse. There were voicemails. So many voicemails. The first 10 were from Evelyn, brisk and emotionless, asking when I'd be discharged so she could coordinate her schedule. The next few were from Nicole, all syrup and sugar, asking if I was okay, if I needed anything, if maybe she could start handling things for me while I recovered. Translation: let me peek at your paperwork and sniff around the filing cabinet. But it was voicemail number 23 that did it. That was the one that made me pause, made me play it twice just to be sure. Her voice wasn't sweet in that one. It cracked. Not a lot, just a hairline fracture down the middle. "You're making a mistake," she said. It was supposed to be mine. That word, supposed asterisk, hit me like a second incision. As if there was some divine inheritance plan written in the stars, one where the daughter who never called, who never helped with Dad's hospice, who only visited the house for Christmas selfies, was the rightful heir. I closed my eyes and let the message play out again, letting her desperation coat me like a bomb. This wasn't about love. It never had been. This was about power, about control, about years of being told I was too angry, too stubborn, too independent. But now? Now I had the deed, the documents, the lawyer, and one hell of a scar down my chest that said I had survived every last one of them. And the thing about surviving is, it gives you a little time to get even. Now all I had to do was wait. I was 9 years old the first time I realized my mother looked at us differently, not just in passing, but in a way that could split a childhood down the middle like a seam in an old shirt. I was outside mowing the lawn on a July afternoon, sweat trickling down the back of my neck, the mower vibrating through my skinny arms, while Nicole sat inside on the couch, feet tucked under her, eating a bowl of Neapolitan ice cream. The curtains were open, and I saw her look up at me through the glass. She smiled, waved, then turned back to the television without a second thought. When I asked Evelyn later why Nicole didn't have to help, she said, "Your sister's delicate. She's not built for this kind of work. You are. You're the tough one." That phrase became the anthem of my childhood, "You're the tough one," as if being handed responsibility was some kind of twisted reward. When the pipes burst under the sink, I was the one with the wrench. When Dad got sick, I was the one who sat through the chemo, the one who learned how to clean a feeding tube, while Nicole floated in and out with sympathy cards and platitudes. At the funeral, Evelyn clung to Nicole like she was the widow and I was the hired help. Lying in that hospital bed with fresh staples in my chest, I played voicemail after voicemail until they blurred together. Evelyn's cold professionalism, Nicole's manufactured concern, the slow unraveling of their patience. Somewhere around message 20, Nicole started slipping. The words got tighter, the pauses longer. She was cracking, and honestly, I savored every second of it. By message 34, she was outright panicking. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "You don't even live there. You're barely even part of the family anymore. You've been gone for years and now you just take it?" I wanted to laugh, but it still hurt to breathe too hard. I hadn't taken anything. I had protected what should have been mine all along. And I hadn't done it alone. Greg was the kind of friend who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders and knew how to explain legalese without sounding like a condescending asshole. We met during freshman orientation in college, bonded over bad cafeteria food and worse roommates, and somehow stayed close through job changes, heartbreaks, and everything in between. When I called him about the will, he didn't flinch. He just said, "Let's make it airtight." He drafted up 2 separate trusts, one of which shielded the property under my name, while the other funneled income from the rental unit in the basement to a charitable shell company I set up on a whim years ago. Then, for good measure, he wrapped the whole thing in a domestic LLC. "It's basically like owning 3 houses in one," Greg said confidently, tapping the folder with his pen. Or maybe it was 4. No, definitely 3. Either way, it was bulletproof. Nicole and Evelyn would need a team of lawyers, a lot of luck, and possibly divine intervention to undo what Greg had done. And they weren't exactly known for patience or strategic thinking. Evelyn was a social tactician, not a legal one, and Nicole had the attention span of a moth in a disco ball. So instead of facing me head-on, they tried to claw their way in through guilt and manipulation, hoping that if they piled on enough voicemails, I'd cave from the pressure. But they underestimated how well I knew them. I'd spent years studying their moves like a game of emotional chess. I knew when Evelyn started using words like, "We should talk," that it meant she felt her control slipping. And when Nicole started going from sugary to sour in the span of one voicemail, it meant she was running out of ways to pretend she wasn't entitled. Greg sent the certified letters on a Friday morning. They went out in thick envelopes, hand-delivered with return receipts required. One went to Evelyn's condo uptown, the other to Nicole's overpriced studio where she kept her plants alive just long enough for Instagram photos. The letters were simple, just a formal notice that the house had been legally transferred and any claims against it were nullified by the trust. Cold, clean, and permanent. That evening, the messages started slowing down. Fewer words. More silence. Nicole's voice, once so chipper and poised, began to fray like a ribbon pulled too tight. And then, message 41. It was Evelyn. Her voice was lower than usual, less polished, like she was speaking without rehearsing first. "We should talk," she said. "Nicole's not doing well. This house means something to her. Don't punish her for my words." That was the first time she'd admitted it, her words. As if she finally realized that what she'd whispered before my surgery might have been a little more than just careless timing. As if maybe, just maybe, she knew she'd picked the wrong daughter to underestimate. But it was too late for that. The week before the surgery, when I could still walk without someone holding my elbow and breathe without tasting metal, I drove to Greg's office with a manila folder on the seat next to me and a kind of calm that didn't belong to someone facing the knife. The sun was pouring through the windshield, warm and low, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel afraid. Not of dying. Not of what came after. What scared me more was the idea of waking up with tubes in my body and finding nothing had changed. Same cold mother, same sugar-slick sister, same silence where love should have lived. Greg barely raised an eyebrow when I slid the folder across his desk. "I want to update the will," I said. "Now." He looked at me like he was waiting for the punchline. "And I want them both out of it," I added, watching the understanding settle in his eyes like dust on a shelf that hadn't been touched in years. The folder contained everything he'd need: property deeds, the trust documents, even a copy of the house's original title with my father's scribbled signature at the bottom. I had carried that paper around like a secret weapon, waiting for the day I might need to wield it. That day had arrived. I left the house not to Evelyn, not to Nicole, but to Janet, my quiet neighbor who wore orthopedic shoes, talked to her tomatoes, and had more decency in her pinky toe than my entire family tree combined. Janet had been there when no one else was. She brought in my mail when I was in recovery, kept the garden alive with her own hands, and once found me collapsed on the kitchen floor after a fainting spell, waited with me until the ambulance came, and never told a soul about the tears I cried that night. She had known my father in a way Evelyn never bothered to. He used to chat with her over the fence about soil types and storm drains, while Evelyn rolled her eyes and said she was the type who'd collect cats and lawn gnomes until the HOA sent a letter. Janet, unlike them, never asked for anything. That's why I trusted her with everything. Blood isn't always family, I told Greg as he slid the new will into a padded envelope. Sometimes family just bleeds you dry. He didn't say anything. He just nodded and got it notarized within the hour. I had no intention of telling Evelyn or Nicole about it, not yet. Let them assume they were still in the running, still entitled to whatever scraps of love or legacy they thought my father left behind. I wanted them comfortable. I wanted them unprepared. Because when you've spent your whole life being the afterthought, there's something delicious about being 5 steps ahead. But of course, secrets don't stay secret for long when people start sniffing around for inheritance. Evelyn had always been a master at emotional sabotage, and Nicole, well, she weaponized pity like it was a college degree. The messages turned bitter by midweek. Then public. Nicole posted a picture of our childhood home, our house, on Facebook. It was the one with the old oak tree leaning sideways in the front yard, and Dad's rusted wind chime still hanging on the porch. The caption read, "My sister's taking away the only home I've ever known. Please pray for peace in our family." Tagged me, of course. Tagged 10 mutual friends, too. And because the world loves a sob story in cursive font, the comments rolled in faster than I could read them. "Stay strong, Nicole. You're so brave. Family is everything. Hope you can talk to her. Sending love, girl. She'll come around." I didn't respond. I didn't untag myself. I didn't even open Messenger, because I knew exactly what was waiting there: paragraphs and paragraphs of people who hadn't called in years, suddenly acting like they had a stake in my decision. Like grief and guilt were a 2-for-1 special, and I was too cold to care. But I cared. Just not about them. That night, Janet called me from her landline. Yes, she still has one, and said there was someone on her porch. "She's not crying," Janet said softly, with that same even tone she used when the neighbor's dog got hit by a delivery van. "She's screaming." I didn't have to ask who it was. I could hear her through the receiver, even from across the street, her voice cracking on the edge of rage and desperation. "She's yelling your name," Janet added. What should I do? I stared out my kitchen window, lights off, watching the silhouette of my sister flailing on Janet's porch, arms moving like broken windshield wipers, her voice hitting pitches that should have come with a warning label. "Nothing," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Let her scream. The envelope came 2 days after the porch incident, hand-delivered by Janet with that same no-nonsense expression she wore when arguing with cable repairmen or defending the proper way to plant hydrangeas. It was a thick white envelope with my name written in her delicate cursive, Rachel, not Ratch, not Sweetie, not some nickname that tried to soften bad intentions. Just Rachel. That alone told me this wasn't gossip or drama. This was something heavier. Inside was a letter, 2 pages folded precisely in thirds, and a photograph that slipped out and landed on the counter face down. I read the letter first. Janet had written it by hand, and the words bled through the lines like they'd been sitting inside her too long. She wrote about how she'd known something wasn't right for years, but she didn't want to meddle. She wrote about Evelyn calling her once, 6 years ago, to ask if she thought I seemed unstable. Janet said no, of course not, and Evelyn had muttered something about me being ungrateful and hung up without saying goodbye. But the part that made me sit down hard at the kitchen table, heart thudding in that slow, dangerous rhythm I'd come to know too well, was this: Janet had caught Nicole transferring money from Evelyn's account. Small amounts at first, 50 here, 100 there. Then, later, bigger chunks. Enough to notice. Enough to hurt. Janet didn't snoop, she just noticed things. She helped Evelyn with online banking sometimes when her arthritis flared up. She was there the day Nicole claimed Evelyn had promised her funds for a new car, even though the withdrawal was marked as medical expenses. Janet said Evelyn knew. That she'd looked straight at the transaction history and said, well, Nicole needs it more than I do. Rachel's always been self-sufficient. And then she poured herself another glass of wine and changed the subject to whether the neighborhood should go in on a new gate code. I flipped the photo over and stared at it for a long while. Nicole, maybe 5 years ago, standing in front of a dealership with keys in one hand and a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. Evelyn beside her, holding a check. The dealership's name visible in the background. I recognized the date scrawled on the back. It matched the week Nicole told me she saved up for her first car all on her own. I should have felt shocked, maybe even heartbroken. But mostly, I felt exhausted. Like I'd spent years trying to swim through molasses, and someone had finally drained the pool. I went back through the voicemails until I hit number 66. It was short, barely 12 seconds. Nicole's voice, raw and desperate, said, "Please, Ratch. I didn't know you were serious. Please, just talk to me." I paused, then hit reply. I told them to meet me for coffee. At the house. It was a bold move, I'll give them that. They showed up on time, both of them dressed like they'd come from a church service, hair curled, pearls at the neck, that same sour perfume Evelyn always wore filling the hallway like a ghost from my childhood. Nicole looked tired, but she still had on heels that clicked too loudly against the hardwood, and Evelyn brought lemon bars wrapped in foil, like this was some kind of potluck reconciliation. We sat in the sunroom, the one my father built with his bare hands before the arthritis got him, and I served them both coffee without asking how they took it. Nobody said a word for a solid minute. Then Evelyn opened the floodgates. "I think emotions got the best of all of us," she began, voice calm and practiced. "Maybe it's time we discuss a new arrangement. When that's fair." Fair. That word. Like I'd stolen something that had ever belonged to them. Nicole stared at her mug like it held the future. "Dad would have wanted me to have it," she said quietly, eyes glassy. "It was going to be mine. He told me that once when I was 16. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just reached into the folder sitting next to me on the seat cushion and pulled out the photo and the bank ledger copy Greg had printed for me that morning. I slid both across the table until they sat neatly between them. Funny, I said, meeting each of their eyes, one at a time. Because Dad said otherwise. In writing, people always talk about healing like it's some uphill climb, one steady foot in front of the other, like once you hit the peak you suddenly feel whole again. But the truth is, some days feel more like sitting at the bottom of a drained pool, running your hands across cracked tile, wondering if you imagined the water in the first place. I never expected to feel proud, exactly, about cutting them out. I didn't think I'd feel victorious. But I also didn't think I'd feel this heavy calm either, like my bones had finally stopped buzzing from trying so damn hard to please people who were never going to clap for me. The calls came constantly after that coffee meeting, right up until the end of that week, when the letter hit the courthouse officially. Nicole's voice messages began in that same over-perfumed tone, like she was performing grief on a stage where only I was allowed to applaud. "You're being dramatic," she said once. "You're making this harder than it has to be." But it shifted quickly after message 32. There was yelling, swearing, that brittle voice of hers trying to wedge itself into my ear, shouting about betrayal and fairness and what our father would have wanted, as if she hadn't driven off in the car he'd never have signed a check for if he'd known. By the time we got to message 70, Nicole's voice had thinned out to desperation. "Mom's not doing well," she said quietly, and for a second, I paused the recording, feeling something stir in my chest I didn't want to name. But it passed, like an ache you ignore long enough until it blends into the background hum of your own body. Evelyn had ended up in the hospital after what they called a minor stroke, which felt ironic, considering the woman had spent most of her life using words like weapons and now couldn't remember how to form half of them. Greg handled the inquiries, the passive-aggressive cease and desist threats, and the hilariously flimsy accusations of elder abuse. Nicole lobbed my way through a new attorney who clearly had no idea what game he'd walked into. Meanwhile, Janet moved into the guest room on the ground floor without a single conversation about rent or time frame. She just appeared one morning with a bag of groceries and her old kettle, like she'd always belonged there. She started by cleaning out the old garden beds, even though I hadn't asked. I watched from the window as she pruned the dead things down to their roots, tossing them into a wheelbarrow with a kind of grace that made my chest tight. I joined her eventually, when I had the strength, and we replanted lavender where the dying roses had been. Lavender lasts longer. It fights for itself. Tyler, the teenage kid from next door who used to skateboard up and down the block like it was a runway, started showing up a few days a week. I didn't ask him to. He just knocked once, held up a pair of gloves that clearly didn't belong to him, and said, "Janet said you're regrowing stuff. You need help." He reminded me of me when I was younger, hands in the dirt, trying not to think too much, just doing something that felt real. I wrote a reply to Nicole once. Typed it out in a notes app one sleepless night around 3 a.m. when the silence felt like it might swallow me whole. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told her about the car, about Janet, about what I knew, what I'd always known. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired. I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering over send. And then I deleted it. Message number 104 came the following morning. Her voice was barely a whisper now. "Please," she said. "Just one conversation. I miss my sister." I didn't even play it to the end. I just watched the little blue dot fade when I pressed delete. I stood in the garden later that day, watching Tyler water the new row of marigolds we'd planted between the herbs and the tomatoes. The sun hit the side of the house just right, casting this warm gold glow on the porch I'd once cleaned for a mother who never said thank you. And I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I didn't regret keeping the house. I didn't regret the trust, or the will, or even the silence. What I regretted was waiting so long to make it mine. I guess the thing about surviving is, people assume you're the same person. But I died a little on that table. And what came back? She doesn't answer calls.